Welcome to Bitcoin Escape Plan. The topic of today's video is how correlated is Bitcoin to the S&P 500. We're going to go all the way back to the earliest points of the Bitcoin chart on the Bitstamp, as well as comparing that to SPY during that time period and giving a little bit of historical context for what was going on with the real estate market during that time. If you're new here, welcome to Bitcoin Escape Plan. You can go subscribe over on the website to get the full newsletter. And if you want to get the full version of this video, because it will randomly cut off at some point, it's $99 a year over at bitcoinescapeplan.com, and you'll get full access to this YouTube breakdown as well as the paid newsletter that is going over it. Let's jump into it. So 2011 is the earliest point that we have data for the Bitstamp chart, around 2011 August for Bitcoin. Obviously, we have more data for that for the SPY. And if we're looking at this, price is kind of irrelevant at this time. Still very, very small for Bitcoin, like less than $10 for most of this time period. So really nothing to be that excited about, not something that's on the radar for most serious investors at this time. Not even connected to the US dollar yet at this point, I don't believe, unless that's literally the first month that it was connected. I'm not sure of that. Somebody correct me of that in the comments. The context, however, is the real estate market had started dropping around June, July of 2007. Again, this is SPY, it's not stock market, or not real estate market, but just to give you broad context. And SPY continues until about November, October of that year before it also starts to drop in 2008. So this is the earliest that we have data for Bitcoin, is around 2009, and it was made specifically because of this moment on the chart. This is why Bitcoin was created. That's going to be important later on in the video. So August of 2011 is the first amount of data that we have on Bitcoin, and what's happening for SPY during that time. That's the first time after it's successfully risen above its monthly SMA after the great financial crisis, has dipped down to it in 2010, has regained strength, and then it's continued higher into 2011 before it does break below in August of 2011, which correlates to this drop here as well. It's actually too early for us to even have data on the SMA for Bitcoin, at least on this chart, but that's all right. So Bitcoin then is getting back to these relative highs by about middle of July of 2012. So it loses all of this value, takes until middle to end of 2012 to get it back. Whereas over here, SPY is already at new highs by the beginning of that year. It does give back some of it in the middle of the year, which is when Bitcoin is already ripping hard in July, whereas SPY is giving up some of that value in July. Where's July? Yeah. Sorry, this is a little confusing. Yeah. So by July, Bitcoin is ripping higher. By July over here, we're just kind of like back to highs. So SPY doesn't start really ripping until a little bit after that in 2013. But look at what Bitcoin did during that time in 2013. So much, much more pronounced jump to the upside. I believe that they both have slight retracements around here. This is pretty normal for between April and June for there to be some downside seasonality. Same thing for August, September. It seems like both have some downside seasonality during that time, but they both just keep ripping. And this is really the first major divergence that we see that I think we need to pay attention to for these charts is, as we know, Bitcoin will experience a sharp blow off top at some point, in this case in November, December of 2013, before it starts dropping all the way into 2015 in this particular instance. So this is the longest bear market that we really have to study for Bitcoin. But SPY is not doing that. Over 2014, while Bitcoin was dropping the whole year, SPY continued to rise that whole year into 2015 before it starts to have some declines towards the end of 2015 and really doesn't start to recover until Q2 of 2016. What's happening over here? We've bottomed out by around August of 2015 and then start to recover by pretty much the end of 2015 going into 2016. So they both kind of start the recovery in 2016. It's just a little bit more noticeable, I think, for Bitcoin because SPY wasn't quite as violent during these drops. Even these drops here, this is still comfortably higher than these highs over in 2007, whereas Bitcoin drops still pretty comfortably higher. When you think about it in context, if it's $10 over here in 2012 and now the lows are like $200 over here in 2015, that's still pretty amazing, like how far different it actually is in that time period over the other one. But this major divergence that we see in 2016, as it just starts to rise and rise and rise into 2017 for Bitcoin, is pretty similar to what we see for SPY as well. Not as sharp for SPY, obviously. It's more gradual. In general, I talk about this in the newsletter. It does seem like SPY is just going to more gradually continue to grind towards the upside, even during periods of major stress, which we're going to get into a little bit later on in 2022 part of the video. But anytime that there is a major move in SPY, it will typically be felt in Bitcoin. So this is July, August of 2016. Let's see. July, August of 2016 over here. So July has a peak. August. So actually it looks like it takes a little bit longer to give back the momentum for SPY than it did for Bitcoin. Just seems like any move that's going to happen with SPY, you can kind of shorten the amount of time that's going to happen with Bitcoin. And then we start to really see this meteoric rise at the beginning of 2017 for Bitcoin. Obviously, everyone knows how that goes. We set highs in December and then give that back going into 2018, give that back for the whole year going into early 2019. And it's actually kind of similar for SPY at this point. So it continues up for most of 2018 when Bitcoin is already dropping during this time. It does have periods where it is giving back some of those gains, but the real sincere drop for SPY doesn't happen until the end of 2018. So at the end of 2018, we start to see a recovery, which then obviously does get wiped by COVID, but no one could really anticipate that other than Bill Gates, of course. And very similar over here for Bitcoin. So what we can kind of anticipate or interpret from this, if we're going to see a similar circumstance now, which this is my base case, I've talked about this in plenty of previous videos. This is how I did all my analysis for 2025, was taking assumptions from the 2017 cycle and applying them to the 2025 cycle, because who was president in 2017? Donald J. Trump was president. So I'm going to assume that something sort of similar is going to happen for Bitcoin, where by February or March, it's going to be really clear that we're dropping off a cliff and that we're just going to continue, and in the inverse for SPY, will probably top out either January or February from this most recent move. We'll give back some of that into Q2, but then we will rally into the summer. Whereas Bitcoin, I don't anticipate a summer rally. I anticipate we're going to continue to drop. And you got to remember the context. We're already at the monthly SMA right now for Bitcoin. So previously in this cycle, that did not happen for all of 2018. It kept dropping for all of 2018 before it actually hit the monthly SMA, whereas we're already at this point right now in 2026 as we are currently sitting on the chart. So if we look at this, this is when we start to recover. We have a major recovery by May of 2019. May of 2019 for SPY, we're touching the SMA again after breaking below, breaking above, showing strength, and then are rising really right before that COVID drop again, which no one could really anticipate that was going to happen. And then what happens for SPY after that? A meteoric rise going all the way into January of 2022. And then this is really the first time that we see a major similarity, I would say, in terms of a bear market for Bitcoin and SPY, because we already know what Bitcoin does during that time period. So Bitcoin shoots up in March, April, and then drops down, and then goes back up at the end of the year, whereas SPY didn't really experience a double peak. It just kind of continued and continued until around the same time, December, January, and then it did start to give that back for all of 2022. And this is largely because of the banking crisis, actually. There's stress in the real estate market during this time. There's just a lot of things that are changing in finance, specifically during 2022, that was putting pressure on all markets, not just Bitcoin, not just SPY. Plenty of things were going down during this time period before, of course, it starts to sharply uptick. And then over here this is March 2024, and this is when Bitcoin sees its first new all-time high during a halving year, which is out of character for the chart. We don't have any other precedent for this in the chart. It's never done that before, where it's at new all-time highs in 2024. That's because the ETFs go live right here, and now tons of new volume is permanently in the market and will stay in the market.